we've been targeting broad adaptation for soybeans, so having the one variety adapted to a very wide north-south range and also to a wide range of planting dates within a location. That's important because growers will tend to want to plant in response to rainfall events that are not particularly reliable, and you need the one variety to produce enough planting seed so that if one region doesn't have a soy plant this year, the variety is also well adapted to the region that does have a soy plant. Over the last 15 or 20 years or so, we've transitioned in soybean from varieties that were largely targeted for oilseed crushing. Soybean gets crushed for oilseed and then gets used for either oil and stock feed, to varieties that are much more focused on human consumption. And that's in response partially to the expansion of GM soybeans elsewhere in the world. That's meant that buyers have chased non-GM beans for human consumption from us. And so in turn, that's meant that we've needed to chase quality traits that are associated with higher values for human consumption. You're probably aware soybean gets transformed into a massive array of food products. So there's the traditional food products like tofu and soy milk. So some of our more recent varieties actually are better for making tofu because they have protein of a type in the seed that when you transform into tofu, the tofu gels more firmly and holds water more tightly, and so it gives a higher yield, a better quality tofu, for example. So our varieties, Bunya and Hayman, are good in that respect. So this is some seed of Hayman. You can see it's got a clear island. There's no pigment in the spot where the seed attaches to the pod wall. Tofu manufacturers like them big and clean and bright looking, and with high protein content. Other attributes of human consumption beans is they do actually need to be attractive. You can't have beans that are mouldy or weathered or whatever. So one of the key areas of work in the breeding program has been to breed for tolerance to pre-harvest weathering. Most of that work's done by my colleague Natalie Moore at Grafton. So we see most of the varieties that are grown in those more weathering prone regions are able to tolerate 5 to 7 days of in-crop rainfall when the crop is mature without losing too much quality. Whereas the old varieties, a couple of days of rain and probably you wouldn't even get it into a crushing market. It had been so damaged that it's really close to worthless. We've been running this work on herbicide tolerance for some years now. Some of the problematic weeds in coastal environments, for example, so things like nutgrass, legume weeds like Ceratro, bellvine, those kinds of things. So we need a sufficient tolerance in the tolerant genotypes that they can be exposed to the herbicide and then come away and yield normally. The other things we do in the breeding program are breeding for disease resistance. So we have to maintain a whole suite of disease resistances like Phytophthora root rot, bacterial pustule, bacterial blight, downy and powdery mildew, those sorts of things. And more recently we've moved on to rust resistance. So as soybean has tended to move into more coastal environments, those environments can be somewhat more prone to soybean rust. And so rust has been emerging as more of an issue. Now many of those leaf diseases, for example, powdery mildew, it might look terrible, but the yield penalty often is not particularly big. Rust, on the other hand, only happens 1 year in 3 or 1 year in 5. But the year when you get it, you can get 50 to 80% reduction in yield. So it's important that we start stacking those kinds of protective traits into varieties as well.